Good morning and welcome to Unitarian Universalist Church West. Welcome to this community of comfort, connection, challenge, and caring. My name is Eddie Daniel, and as a member of the worship ministry team, I'm happy to be leading the service today. If you are new to UU Church West, I'd like to give you an extra special welcome. Checking out a new spiritual community can be a courageous act, even when we are doing church virtually. We would love to connect with you. If you send an email message to visitor@uucw.org, we will be in touch. Now I'd like to introduce the team of people who have contributed to today's service. The music is led by Jennifer Nicolosi, our lead music director, with, as you've already heard, some videotaped help from our resident band, Kaleidoscope. Dave Cicero, our director of Lifespan Religious Education, is also with us. And Kelly Bognar, our publications coordinator, is working behind the scenes to manage the technology that makes our service possible. And I'm delighted to welcome the Reverend Denise Cawley back once again, live and in person, as our pulpit guest this morning. If you missed her last Sunday, Denise is a UU minister who lives in Milwaukee and serves the Unitarian Universalist Community Church of Washington County in Hillsboro, Oregon. Yes, you heard that right. That's a bit of a stretch, right? In July, just in July, she was ordained at Bradford Unitarian Universalist Community Church in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where she served as the intern minister for the last 2 years. Denise has provided spiritual and emotional care chaplaincy at Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin. Denise has been a pivotal player in diversity, inclusion, marriage equality, and voting rights for 3 decades. Denise is also a renowned fiber artist in the Midwest. She says that she loves walking by big bodies of water and that her art is a vivid part of her spiritual practice. Welcome, Denise. Now, please join in singing our opening hymn, number 1026, If Every Woman. The words are printed in the order of service that we sent out with our e-news on Thursday. Here's Jen.
Justice and liberation. Every nation in the world set a true course for freedom. If every nation raised its children in a culture of peace, if all our sons and all our daughters reached in friendship across the borders, refusing to be enemies, there would be no war.
If only, yes. Good morning. I invite you to light your own home chalice, if you have one, and join me in reading the words that were shared earlier in the week in the order of service. We light this chalice with the courage of our deepest convictions to work for equity, racial justice, and peace. By its light, we pledge our love to aid our neighbors and help heal a hurting world. As it shines, we embrace the mystery and wonder of all that is and all that is yet to be.
A hero is a person who is greatly admired by others for their courage, achievements, or noble qualities. We look to them as role models of how we might be our best selves by living or acting in a way they have. Who are yours? If you're like me, the answer tends to change over time. I was an early reader when I was young and a big fan of the Little House series of books by Laura Ingalls Wilder. I think I read just about all of them. I'm not sure if my hero was Laura or her pa, but I admired the family's courage and self-sufficiency as they established their homestead on the Midwestern frontier. Nowadays, the books by the author, the real Laura Ingalls, are considered fairly racist in the way they depict Native Americans and other people of color. I've not gone back to reread them and judge for myself, but this does show that when we don't know someone personally, our impression of them can become romanticized. A cautionary tale about hero worship. Superheroes have become very common in entertainment media. While purely fictional, they can embody qualities that we strive to emulate. A question I hear a lot among superhero fans is, Superman or Batman? Well, not one to ever choose the obvious path. My answer is Spider-Man. Not someone alien to our world or a super rich millionaire, but Peter Parker. A young person, the victim of a tragic accident, but who took advantage of his skills as a scientist to help others and avenge the loss of loved ones by fighting crime. How can you vote against the guy who does whatever a spider can, spins a web any size, catches thieves just like flies? As you might have guessed from that little riff, my experience was not with the modern Spider-Man, known to some of us through the movies, but the animated one that I could watch on TV after school and see in the 35-cent comic books that I would buy with the change from the money my mom would give us to buy a gallon of milk at the corner grocery. Now, many of you may cringe when you learn who my sports hero was growing up, because I did so south of the Illinois border. Yes, he wore the dreaded navy and orange of the Chicago Bears. Luckily for our purposes here, he also played for a team as hapless as any other in the NFC Central at the time. But I've not met a Packers fan yet who hasn't admitting having at least respect for number 34, Walter Payton, also known as Sweetness. If you ever heard him speak, then you know this man had a voice that matched his nickname. With which he played the otherwise brutal sport of football. As a fan, I learned of and was awed by his crazy work ethic and determination. This showed itself not only in his on-field performance, but also in his preparation. This determination extended to his care for the community that supported him in fulfilling his own dreams. In addition to winning the NFL's annual Humanitarian Award while a player, Walter Payton's name now adorns it in honor of his commitment to serving others. My musical hero as I got older was Neil Young. I discovered his acoustic folk rock with an occasional heavy dose of grunge that later bands would also adopt, amid the hard rock and sappy love songs of the 1980s. I related to the brooding image he took on stage when playing solo, and with the awkward but unbridled energy, and some would say sloppy guitar work, when rocking out with others. In the decades since, I admired him for the integrity with which he creates his music, insisting on it being unpolluted by corporate interests. As a result, I always think of Neil Young as a bit of an outsider or an underdog, despite his overall success. Politically, my heroes have also tended to be underdogs. I don't think I voted for a winning presidential candidate until I was in my 40s. Call me idealistic, but I've always felt our governmental leaders ought to have a track record of protecting the rights of those in the minority, fighting for justice, despite any potential conflict with what seems politically convenient. These are the people that usually get my vote. Someone else who gets my vote, I'm sure you don't recognize. I met Chris Fontana as a teenager. We went to the same college, and Chris was probably the first person that challenged me to stand up for what was right. At the time, that meant demonstrating during our graduation ceremony for the university to divest from South Africa. Since then, Chris has been a teacher and has founded 2 nonprofit organizations. The first was Global Visionaries, which promotes cultural and environmental stewardship, especially by youth. He now runs Full Circle Leadership, dedicated to helping teachers and parents promote democratic principles in their classrooms and homes. From Chris, I've learned to be courageous and take risks to promote what I believe is right. Now, it was about the time that Chris and his high school students were organizing a global youth environmental summit that I discovered the writing of Wendell Berry. My friend Chris still cites my invitation to Berry to be a keynote speaker at their second conference, and more specifically, him declining that invitation, as a continuing source of inspiration. You see, Berry told us in a handwritten note that flying halfway across the country conflicted with his responsibility as a citizen of the planet, and so he would be unable to participate. He had a moral obligation to himself to live in concert with his values. The last hero I'm sharing with you also has a long history of being guided by her values. I would say that I haven't always agreed personally with all of them, but I have always respected her commitment to them and have always loved her. Her is my mom, Judy Cicero. Her unconditional love for her family and her God, and I'm not sure which comes first because they're so intertwined for her, dictates her choices and actions always. Mom committed a large part of her adult life to raising 6 children, then earned a degree in counseling and assisted unwed mothers until retiring. She did this all while continuing as a supportive wife and active leader in her church for like forever. From my mom, I've learned to use love as the primary guiding principle.
So these are some people that I have admired in my life. I encourage you to think about who your role models are. Today, we're hearing from Reverend Cawley about an early UU hero who it sounds like was pretty much a role model for some of the things that she's involved with in her professional life as well. This is the Reverend Florence Buck. So listen to the qualities in her life that you look for in a hero. What did Reverend Buck achieve in her life? How brave must she have needed to be? What innate qualities did she need to tap into to help herself? And what might you learn for yourself from her story?
And now please join with me in singing our next hymn, hymn 1001, Breaths. The words are in the order of service.
Listen more often to things and to beings. Listen more often to things and to beings. 'Tis the ancestors' breath when the fire's voice is heard. 'Tis the ancestors' breath in the voice of the waters. Those who have died have never, never left. The dead are not under the earth. They are in the rustling trees. They are in the groaning woods. They are in the crying grass. They are in the moaning rocks. The dead are not under the earth. So listen more often to things and to beings. Listen more often to things and to beings. 'Tis the ancestors' breath when the fire's voice is heard. 'Tis the ancestors' breath in the voice of the waters. Those who have died have never, never left. The dead have a pact with the living. They are in the woman's breast. They are in the wailing child. They are with us in our homes. They are with us in this crowd. The dead have a pact with the living. So listen more often to things and to beings. Listen more often to things and to beings. 'Tis the ancestors' breath when the fire's voice is heard. 'Tis the ancestors' breath in the voice of the waters.
Thank you for that beautiful music. As we take a moment to take a deep, deep breath, get into a comfortable space, and think about these words by our Unitarian ancestor, Reverend Dr. Florence Buck. I've adapted these words from hers. May this community light our path to fruitful knowledge and help us to deliver right attitudes of mind and spirit. Our community teaches us to put religion into action. Our principles illuminate paths to moral character and guide us to protect the weak against the aggression of the strong. Today, as you learn more about one of our historic ancestors, consider how you have felt like her at times. Has it been difficult to marry science and religion? Have you felt like the only sane person in the room? Were you constantly pushed aside by people with more power than you? Have you felt the call to your faith with such passion you had to carry out your calling regardless of who stood in your way? See that, look at it, recognize it, breathe. You are loved, You are loved. You are loved.
You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trot me down in the very dirt, and still like the dust I'll rise. Use my happiness, upset you. Why are you best with gloom? 'Cause I laugh like I got no well pumping in my living room. So you may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes. I'll rise, I'll rise, I'll rise, rise, rise. Out of the shacks of history, shame, from past renewed pain. I'll rise, I'll rise, I'll rise, rise, rise. Did you want to see me broken? I'll never roll eyes. Shoulders falling down like teardrops leaking while my soul cries. Does my confidence upset you? Don't you take it all hard. 'Cause I run like I've got none breaking out in my yard. So you may shoot me with your words, you may come with your eyes. I'll rise, I'll rise, I'll rise, rise, rise. Out of the shacks of history, shame, all past minute pain. I'll rise, I'll rise, I'll rise, rise. So you may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trot me down in the very dirt, and still like the dust I'll rise. Does my happiness upset you? While I'm best with you, 'cause I'll die the night I know I'm here on my own. You may shoot me with your words, you may write me with your eyes. I'll rise, I'll rise, I'll rise, rise. Out of the shacks of history, shame, from past renewed pain. I'll rise, I'll rise, I'll rise, rise. Yes, I'll rise, I'll rise, I'll rise. Yes, I'll rise, I'll rise, I'll rise.
Today I share a reading with you from one of my heroes, Reverend Dr. Florence Buck. Now, she was born 160 years ago. And to keep some context at the time, this is when we were Unitarians. We weren't Unitarian Universalists. And we were known as a progressive Christian religion because the word Unitarian means one God, that we didn't believe in the Trinity. She was very proud of being a very progressive Christian. She wrote this at a meeting of the Unitarian Sunday School Society. She was one of our national teachers for Sunday school and developing the first curriculums that we had. She said, "We are here trying to cultivate right responses to the situations in life that life itself presents. It is necessary first that we all get clearly in mind our realm in the church school. The purpose is threefold," she said. "For our first aim is that pupils shall know some things needful about religion." This is the knowledge aim of our school. It wasn't necessarily that they had to believe the same way. It was that everyone needed knowledge about religion. Our second aim is that we shall be the best sort of people. This is the character aim. And our third aim is that they shall do the best they know. This is right conduct and service aim. Reverend Dr. Florence Buck was a scientist first. She had her bachelor's and her master's degree in biology and science. She had had a whole career before becoming one of our first women ministers. So her scientific aim she wanted people to understand was that pupils shall gain fruitful knowledge. We may not try to impart all the knowledge, and that in choosing what we will have them know, we must seek for what is valuable for conduct in life. The second scientific aim, she said, was to develop right attitudes of mind and spirit. This, we all know, she said, is one of the best elements of a liberal faith. One's bent of mind, one's interest and loyalties, one's desires for truth are the attitudes which determine what his or her character shall be. Religious instruction, which seeks to develop attitudes, is very different from that which merely imparts rules of life and knowledge of creeds. She was speaking to us not being a creedal faith, but being a covenantal faith. The third scientific aim, she said, is our turmoil in recent years. She was referring to World War I. The three fundamental principles have become clear. Right is the true bias of human association. She's emphasizing community and the interconnected web. Moral obligations rest upon nations as well as individuals. And the weak must be protected against aggressions of the strong. Can you see how she was foreshadowing the UU7 principles that didn't come out for another 50 years? She closes with a quote, "Now these are essentially religious principles. Every great religious teacher has declared them. They formed the essential message of the Hebrew prophet, especially the greatest of them all, the founder of Christianity. These principles apply to both governments and associated groups within governments. That is the whole of life. They are religion in action. They are the core of democracy." Now, when I became a seminarian, going to Meadville Lombard Theological School, I had to study our history, of course, and you had to pick certain topics that you would study greatly in depth. And I thought I would pick someone easy. I thought Florence Buck would be easy, that there would be a lot written about her because she was one of our first women ministers and she was so accomplished. At the time, I didn't realize how accomplished she was. She also had her longest pastorate was at Bradford UU in Kenosha, Wisconsin. So I thought she would be interested in this. I loved that people rumored that she was queer, and I liked the idea of lifting up someone rumored to be a lesbian. I didn't expect to find a friend in our historical ancestor, Reverend Florence Buck. And now I find myself thinking, how did Florence Buck feel? She has never been given credit for how influential she was in religious education. We name all the rooms after Sophia Faz, but really Sophia Faz's ideas all came from seminars she attended with Florence Buck. She doesn't get credit for how much she did for women's rights as one of our first women ministers who traveled all over as a noted speaker, speaking on behalf of the rights of women and those of other nations. She's not given a major role in how much she did in Unitarian Universalist history. And in my research, I discovered that Reverend Buck was addressing anti-racist ideas when people barely acknowledged the topic. I learned Reverend Buck was even teaching children religious education in Black Baptist churches around Boston. And I think about what that must have been like. I am personally inspired by her messages from 100 years ago. And while I hope Unitarian Universalists will embrace her ideas today, I find myself more often wondering, what did Florence feel like? What did it feel like to be Florence? So many of our heroes are not recognized until long after they're dead. Some are never recognized at all. Do you ever feel that way? In 1889, Florence Buck discovered Unitarianism, and she discovered Reverend Marian Murdoch. In my research, I gathered evidence that these women were not just sisterly friends, as a Boston marriage might imply, but intimate queer partners. From the very beginning, they shared travels, home, education, and finances. Reverend Marian Murdoch's letters of introduction of Florence Buck to the famous Unitarian minister Jenkin Lloyd Jones shows intimacy and affection. It's so clear that at first Reverend Jones assumes that Florence Buck is a gentleman. Once this was cleared up, we see Murdoch requesting a cozy room in a faraway farmhouse for the two women to share at the religious education institutes. Did that feel daring? Did it feel secretive? Did they feel like they were simply friends? Did they have a word to call what they felt? Now, Reverend Buck's ideas were big from the start. In 1889, she was writing about the need for Unitarian mega churches and bucking the trend of just having small churches, or that Unitarians should always be smaller than other faiths. She writes to Unitarian leadership in Boston about the importance of sharing our message of liberal Christianity. No more of this Unitarians are not people who share the wonder of our faith. She knew we needed to share this because she knew then it was a life-saving faith. Buck also envisioned robust education programs in our churches, and at one of her pastorates in California, she told the board that if they really wanted to build a church from the ground up, they would not worry so much about having a minister, but they would start by hiring a qualified educator long before they hired a minister. How frustrating it must have been to tell her board of trustees over and over about the importance of investing in religious education, and the key to that being what would grow a church. I came to realize that many ideas we attribute to Sophia Faz, another one of our great Unitarian Universalist ancestors, are ideas rooted in Florence Buck's theology. Buck's writing is difficult to access. Little of it is credited under her name, but only accessible after tracing where she was and looking at documents that came out of those events. Then you can find that she wrote them. In one address, Florence Buck makes an appeal to Unitarians to please stop supporting missions. Stop aiming for a conversion of their faith to our own, and not to think of ourselves as superior to other faiths or other nations. Can you imagine how angry she must have been when she happened upon colleagues? They were male colleagues, all talking about how much smarter they were than the Catholics or the Baptists. In her 1919 address for Religious Education for Democracy, she says, "Perhaps most of us can remember the ways of making an appeal for the missions, which were in vogue in the past. The horrors of the practice and worship and beliefs of the heathen were presented as startling contrast to the excellence of our own faith. We are presented aliens at their worst, ourselves at our best. This method did make us eager to help, but it also cultivates unwarranted senses of superiority, which prevents any real sense of brotherhood," she said. She continues, religion is not alone to blame for this. Songs, stories, articles in our common speech and life tended, and still tend, to cultivate in us the attitude of the Pharisee who thanks God he is not as other men. That sentiment she had about genders and races being equal and all deserving of a liberal education was apparent in the book she wrote, The Story of Jesus, where she included song lyrics about welcoming those from other nations and races. This was written in 1905, well before World War I. The more I delved into Buck's teachings, the more I realized how revolutionary she was in her time. And then I realized how alone she must have felt. In this era of Jim Crow laws, of separate bathrooms and entrances, what did it feel like to walk through those as she traveled around the country making speeches? Throughout Reverend Buck's writings, she emphasizes boys and girls being educated not only for religious reasons, but for developing right attitudes of the mind and spirit. This, we all know, she said, is one of the elements of a liberal faith. Buck was always ready to advocate for the underserved, for equal treatment of all, and for education of all people in all walks of life. She must have been so angry that other women didn't have access to the advanced education she held. I wonder, too, how it felt to know she was more educated. She had more work experience than her male colleagues. Buck was far more accomplished than most ministers, even in Unitarian faith. She had been a teacher and a principal and a headmaster of a school. She indeed used to tutor seminary students studying at Baptist College in Kalamazoo, Michigan. She tutored them in their Greek and Latin. She already had a master's degree and had already done postgraduate work before entering seminary. In fact, she was so versed in Greek and Latin that Methodist students and Baptist students would come to her and ask her questions. They were in seminary, but she couldn't go to seminary. Later she did, but imagine that. She had more degrees than most of her colleagues, more than Marion, her partner, more than Jenkin Lloyd Jones, who helped her become a minister, and more than, this is very important, than the American Unitarian Association, the AUA, what it was called then, more than President Reverend Samuel Eliot, our first president of the AUA. By the time Buck was hired to be Associate Secretary of the AUA, she had numerous degrees, had been one of the first women to do postgraduate work at the seminary at Oxford after she had studied at Meadville Lombard Theological School. Reverend Sam Eliot didn't have all that education, and yet he wouldn't make her the director of the association's religious education. He made her the associate director, even though there was no director. Now, she wrote tons of religious education materials and columns. She would set up all the religious education institutes for all of our lay leaders and ministers to go and learn how to teach religious education. She didn't see it as something just for kids either. She saw it as a way for all kinds of young people, all the way up into their mid-30s, to get some education and perhaps better jobs. Now, her methods were even unusual then, not unusual now, but she would include art and music and drama, doing skits and plays, all to teach religious education. She would even use pictures and songs and conduct pageants. She liked to teach outdoors as she felt that that was a healthier way to learn. Now, none of that really seems that unusual today, but imagine in a time of segregation, imagine that only about 20% of the eligible population of children actually attended school. And Buck's programs were regularly attended by large groups of not yet members. From children to young adults, they were seen as a way of helping to better themselves and building communities. Her ideas were radical. I'd even say she was queering faith formation. Though unheard of at the time, Buck made headlines when she offered a proper funeral for a man who was a known alcoholic. A theme of treating all with inherent worth and dignity is illustrated in her preaching, stating, "One's goodness should be shown not alone by the way he treats his family, his neighbors, and his personal friends or associates, but the way he treats the even more remote, the worker, the poor, the foreigner, and even the criminal and outcast," she said. Not only did Buck queer our faith by turning typical ways of doing things over on their head, she saw no reason to bend to the conventions of marrying a man, nor being alone. As intimate life partners, the Reverends Buck and Murdoch traveled the globe. They worked in Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, California, and Massachusetts during their 35 years together. Their beginning intention, they stated, was the desire to always remain together, and the church that calls one must call the other. However, Cleveland, Ohio was the only time the women held a true co-ministry. The novelty of having two women preachers attracted large crowds when they first took that pulpit. One reporter asked them, "Does it take two women to make up for one male minister?" the reporter asked. Reverend Buck corrected the reporter, explaining how two ministers meant twice the diversity and capacity. Now, I know when I first dated women, I worried who would find out. I was afraid of who would know and would they hurt me. I had feelings like that even after I had been in a relationship for a woman for 2 decades. Yet for me, time helped ease some of that fear. What about you, Florence? Were you always afraid? Did you buck the system anyway? Florence Buck's list of firsts is very long. She was the first honorary doctorate recipient from Meadville Lombard ever given to a woman. She was the first woman to preach at the famous King's Chapel in Boston. She was the first advocating religious education as a way out of poverty and factory work. She was the first to create young adult youth RE, the first woman to edit a hymnal, the Beacon Hymnal, the first director of the Religious Institutes, the author of the Story of Jesus, like I mentioned. It's a huge list. I used to just be in awe of her, but now I have to wonder, Florence, did you do all that you did so that no one would know how afraid you were? Did you accomplish more than others because you wanted to be recognized and promoted the way the men around you were? Did your voice shake when you offered wise advice that no one paid attention to? I wonder if you felt alone. I see you, Florence. I see you. Sadly, Florence Buck died of typhoid fever in 1925 at age 65. In the papers in her ministry file in the archives at Harvard, I found this small little card. It was a note from the Reverend Samuel O. Weems, who was a historian and minister at 5 Black Baptist churches in Boston. He wrote the AUA to let them know that they were naming, one of those 5 churches was building a new chapel and naming it in honor of Florence Buck. because of all the time she spent at the churches that he ran, teaching children in Black neighborhoods in Boston. No one knew about that when she was alive. She didn't go brag about it. What was it like for Florence to go find children so eager for her message that she entered those churches and told no one? Florence, did you feel like you were conducting right action? I bet you did. But I know too, you loved people. You delighted in embracing new ways and learning new cultures. And I'm proud that you didn't feel the need to boast about what you did. You just saw a need and you did it. I think about this very prim and proper lady with golden hair walking into what would have been Black neighborhoods where she surely would have been noticed. At the same time that newspaper headlines from that age spoke of mass lynchings, of anti-Semitism post-World War I. Florence Buck believed everyone deserved liberal Christianity and education as a form of liberation. Yet board minutes where Reverend Dr. Florence Buck served are full of folks that thought a man should deliver these messages instead of her. In fact, they showed she was worth less by paying her a fraction of what a man would be paid. They gave her little credit. Her name was rarely attributed to her accomplishments. How did you feel, Florence? Have you ever felt like Florence? Reverend Buck was willing to turn every notion of how to be a minister, how to educate, and even who to admire or educate on its head. She was queering our faith over 100 years ago. Religion in action, she said. Religion in action is the core of democracy. It is the core of our faith. Now, I know sometimes it feels really lonely acting on that. You may never get the credit. You may live in fear doing what is right action, and yet Reverend Dr. Florence Buck did it every day. And I think she just said, buck it. Buck the patriarchy, buck the misogyny, buck the homophobia. Thank you, Florence. Thank you for saying buck it. Now I invite all of you to say buck it when you feel alone in doing right conduct, right service, or being of right character. Think of her when you inspire others to act out our faith.
Each week, we invite you to give generously to support Unitarian Universalist Church West and its many ministries of caring, compassion, racial justice and social justice, learning, and spiritual growth. We also include among those ministries the work of our Split the Plate partner organizations. You can make a gift online by going to uucw.org and clicking on the Donate tab. You can also give via text message simply by sending UUCW to 73256. And it's possible to mail in a check to make your gift. Watch your screen because all the information about the ways to give will appear there in just a moment. In the meantime, thank you. We appreciate so much your generosity and your commitment to UU Church West.
Our closing words are by Steve J. Crump. That which is worthy of doing, create with your hands. That which is worthy of repeating, speak with a clear voice. That which is worthy of remembering, hold in your hearts. And that which is worthy of living, go and live it now. Blessed be.